Tonight on CBC Vancouver News.
That makes me angry.
Infuriated, local Catholics angry over the church's refusal to take responsibility. Also,
this is not the time to take risks.
Moving up the reopening plan with more than 70% vaccinated in BC, while the province pushed forward. And
he's been planting trees since he was 13 years old in the Czech Republic and in forestry cadets.
Remembering an eccentric BC forester who planted millions of trees before dying of COVID-19.
This is CBC Vancouver News.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. The federal government is calling on the Catholic Church to apologize, and so are those within. The discovery of the remains of more than 200 children at a former residential school near Kamloops has left many local Catholics angry and soul-searching. Briar Stewart has our top story.
Skagga Kane is a deacon in the Catholic Church and a member of the Squamish First Nation, who knows plenty about the horrors of residential schools. But what's emerged from Kamloops is still infuriating.
That makes me angry. I still keep my faith.
The majority of residential schools were run by the Catholic Church, but it's the only one where top officials haven't apologized for its role. And today experts say some Catholic organizations are obstructing efforts to find unmarked burials and identify children by withholding thousands of historical records.
There is a responsibility that lies squarely on the shoulders of the Council of Bishops of Canada.
Some feel it should rest even higher. One of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, a papal apology never offered. The revelations from Kamloops led to the creation of this online group for Catholics struggling with the institution.
I just felt frustrated that this story is still ongoing and people are not feeling they've had the response that we've wanted to see from the church sometimes.
The broader Christian community is also grappling with some of those questions. Daryl DeClerc was drawn to the Kamloops Memorial by grief and guilt. While not Catholic, the pastor says the lack of accountability is inexcusable.
As Christians, we apologize to God every day for all kinds of things. And so I want the church to offer an unequivocal, heartfelt apology.
Back in St. Paul's Indian Church, Skagga Kane says he will persevere.
Despite my thoughts on Kamloops, I am still a member of the church, and I need to find ways to help them. You can see the longhouse.
Which is why during his services, he tries to incorporate Indigenous language and culture, something residential schools try to erase. Briar Stewart, CBC News, Vancouver.
The head of the Catholic Archdiocese of Vancouver is pledging assistance to Indigenous people affected by the preliminary discovery of children's remains in Kamloops. He vows access to archives and assistance to search other sites so remains can be returned home. In a statement, Archbishop J. Michael Miller says, "I'm writing to express my deep apology and profound condolences to the families and communities that have been devastated by this horrific news." Miller adds the church was unquestionably wrong in implementing a government colonialist policy which resulted in devastation for children, families, and communities. And Miller says he apologized to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2013. Miller's pledge comes as Pope Francis faces more calls to issue a formal apology. He refused to do so after Prime Minister Trudeau asked him in 2018. Indigenous Service Minister Mark Miller says it's shameful the Pope has not apologized for the church's role. This story can bring back disturbing and traumatic memories, and there is help available. You can reach the 24-hour Indian Residential School Survivors Society crisis line at 1-866-925-4419. The CUAS crisis line is another option. That information is available on our website, cbc.ca/BC. We will have much more on this story in the days to come. Well, the battle over old-growth logging is heating up on Vancouver Island as more protesters arrive at the Ferry Creek site to take place of those already arrested. As Greg Rasmussen reports, demonstrators say they're digging in for a long fight ahead and defying the RCMP orders to leave.
This woman has buried her hands in the ground beneath this logging road, encased in concrete.
I tied myself into this tube in the ground, and so I'm kind of stuck here until they get me out, basically.
Her goal is to stop loggers from getting access to old-growth trees.
This is so important. This is crucial. This is not replaceable.
RCMP personnel are tasked with removing the protesters.
Here's a structure that some of the protesters have made. It's an enormous log that they've obviously salvaged from around here. What we can see here is that they have put inside there a piece of metal, and then around that they've put concrete. And then she's either holding on to chain or she's actually chained.
It's a shame that it has to come to this. I don't want to be strapped to a log, but it's really hard that we have to be doing this.
The variety of obstacles spread out over multiple locations makes it a slow process to remove them.
On a quick look, it can seem like we're a bunch of dirty hippies, you know, just kicking it out in the woods, trying to prevent people from doing their jobs. But it's so much more than that.
They dropped someone in the tree. He's in the tree above me.
This protester spent 8 nights on a platform 60 meters up an old-growth cedar tree in the path of the logging.
The entire sit was shaking. All the tarps were coming apart.
RCMP officers descended from a helicopter and arrested her.
I think the only truly fearful point I had was when that helicopter was right above my sit. It was really not at a safe distance. I did not know what was going to happen in that moment.
Released from custody, she's pledged to keep up the fight.
Until old growth logging stops, until we start to have more respect for the land and respect for the people of the land, this isn't going to go anywhere.
Old growth logging opponents say hundreds more are willing to be arrested. So in the end, what you have is a very determined group of people up against a police force intent on enforcing this injunction. Greg Rasmussen, CBC News, near Port Renfrew, BC.
BC's plan to modernize the way trees are logged in this province is a welcome move by the industry. But as the CBC's Michelle Gassoub reports, reactions among First Nation communities at the heart of the plan are mixed.
It's the first major update the forestry sector has seen in 20 years. But for some with the closest ties to the land, the trees are priceless.
It's like entering into the Creator's cathedral. The trees are incredibly enormous, they're incredibly majestic, and they carry the genetics of the forest for untold centuries.
Though activists have been trying to bring a stop to the logging of those old-growth forests, the province's plan does not include that. Instead, it redistributes forest tenures to Indigenous nations and small operators. And while some Indigenous communities say it's not good enough, others are glad to have a seat at the table.
It's great that the activists have brought attention to a much needed issue that needs attention, but now the people who are going to be part of the solution really need to come together.
That includes the forest industry, which is applauding the move.
There are jobs all over the place.
Jobs they're in fear of losing, and thousands have been lost already after a rough few years thanks to wildfires, the mountain pine beetle, and a declining timber supply.
If you just shut down old growth logging, that's very nice if you feel you are not connected to it. But there are many families and many communities who put food on the table because of the forest industry.
And this is just another round in a long battle for what some say is the very soul of BC. Michelle Gassoub, CBC News, Vancouver.
The family of a Quesnel tree planter who died of COVID-19 believe he got infected on the job. As Yvette Brand explains, it was a tragic death for a man who planned to live to 100 and could still outplant green planters who were 1/3 his age.
Jerry Cruzel was a fixture in Quesnel, BC. At 79, he was still a formidable tree planter.
Someone actually told me he probably planted about 12 million trees in his life. He's been planting trees since he was 13 years old in the Czech Republic and forestry cadet. So it's very possible he's planted millions of trees out there.
Long before Krusel came to BC, he was slated to train the Czechoslovakian judo team. Then he fled as the Soviets invaded in 1968.
Growing up, when I was in my maybe 8 years old to 12 or so, we used to do a lot of play wrestling together too, and he would always use judo moves. I'm pretty sure he tried to teach me how to do things, but I just enjoyed just flying around half the times.
Krusel ate organic, stayed fit, but he did not get vaccinated, and he began to get weak after a COVID exposure.
Trying to push him to go to the hospital, get tested first off, call 811. I have a really bad feeling about this.
She says her father was stubborn and wanted to fight the virus at home.
My dad just was the elderly person that got infected. He was right there. I'm pretty sure he got infected when they were riding on a truck together or something within proximity. So I would have definitely wanted to change that.
But she says his memory will survive in all the trees he planted and the people whose lives he touched. Yvette Brand, CBC News, Vancouver.
For the second day in a row, BC has seen fewer than 200 cases of COVID-19, 194 reported today. More than 71% of adults in BC have now received a first dose of the COVID-19 vaccine, and nearly 17,000 people have received a second dose yesterday, setting a new daily record. Although BC has surpassed the benchmark vaccine rate outlined in the restart plan to move on to the next step of reopening, Health Minister Adrian Dix doesn't foresee the timeline being moved up.
This is not the time to take risks. This is a time to continue to drive down transmission. So when we said at the earliest June 15th, we meant at the earliest June 15th.
Dix says the focus remains on driving down case counts and the number of people in hospital. Premier John Horgan says a plan is still in the works for reopening Canadian borders to international travelers.
They've been seeking advice and input from all of us from coast to coast to coast about how best for all of us to come back and welcome the world to Canada.
The Premier says the province is working casually behind the scenes with the federal government, which will ultimately decide when borders can reopen with consultation from the provinces and territories. The Greater Vancouver Board of Trade is calling on both levels of government for an implementation plan with set benchmarks. Well, life is back on track in Whistler with the start of the mountain biking season. The ski resort was forced to close its doors in March due to COVID-19. Now, with the majority of the population there being vaccinated, the mountain bike park has reopened. Only a third of the tracks are up and running. The rest will open after the snow melts. Of course, the return of tourism is a welcome sight for visitors and staff in town.
It's our second time doing a bike park in the pandemic, and so we're just happy that we're able to get the lifts spinning again and that people are able to come up and enjoy some semblance of normalcy.
Currently, there are still travel restrictions in place in BC. Only residents of the Vancouver Coastal Health Authority and Fraser Health can visit the mountain, but there are hopes this could change as soon as June 15th. One person is in hospital after a morning fire near 41st Avenue and McDonald Street in Vancouver. Fire crews were called to a house shortly after 10 a.m. First responders found smoke billowing from the upper floor of the building. A fire starting in the ground floor kitchen had spread to the ceiling. The single person in the house tried to put out the fire and suffered burns and smoke inhalation.
I always recommend that if this happens to you, that you don't try and put out the fire. You alert any people that are in the building, get everybody out of the building, get yourself out of the building and call 911.
Fortunately, the injuries are minor, and the victim is expected to make a full recovery. Fire investigators are on scene trying to figure out the initial cause of the blaze. Well, BC is changing its rules around hard hats on job sites to be more inclusive of turban-wearing Sikhs.
There have been increasingly broad hard hat policies on many work sites that have excluded Sikhs that wear the dastar, even where there is no reason to do so.
Starting in September, employers will be required to survey work sites to decide if hard hats are absolutely necessary. PPE headgear will be considered as a last resort, so turban-wearing Sikhs are not excluded from work sites that are considered no risk of falling objects. The province says the focus should shift from reducing injury to eliminating injury overall in setting up work environments. The University of British Columbia is supporting 15 Black students who will attend its law school. Prominent Black judges in BC contributed to the $225,000 fund, including retired Supreme Court Justice Selwyn Romilly. This will be the Peter A. Allard Law School's first ever award to assist Black Canadian students. Their goal is to remove academic financial barriers, as well as to increase Black representation in Canadian courts in efforts to address racial inequality in the justice system. A wildlife care facility on Vancouver Island has received a visit from a rare animal, a white raven.
There's just something magical about it. You know, I was actually here when the raven came in, and I've never seen one.
The white raven possesses ivory-colored plumes and blue eyes thanks to a gene mutation. It has been sparsely spotted around mid-Vancouver Island for the past 20 years. Workers say the raven is just a few months old. It was found on the ground injured and near death.
It's a compromised immune system, and they just don't seem to make it to maturity. So we're hoping that in a captive setting, we can overcome that.
Workers say the bird is growing stronger, though still not eating on its own. They say they'll do everything they can to get it to adulthood. Meteorologist Johanna Wagstaffe joins us now. I'm a little disappointed. I heard a lot of complaints today about how hot it was.
Yes, I did too. It's really split, I would say, down the middle, as far as who is loving the heat and humidity and who cannot wait for it to break. It's an exceptional heat, though, I've got to say. Take a look at the current temperatures out there. So YVR has hit 28 degrees. And keep in mind, YVR is usually the coolest spot across Metro Vancouver as it's right near the water. Now, the last time we hit 28 degrees in early June, the 1970s. So yes, it has been that long since we felt this much heat this early on. We're not breaking records. The record to break in the 1970s was 30 degrees, and I don't quite think we'll make there. But with the humidex, it is feeling like the low 30s. It is hot right across the south coast, across the island and in through the interior as well, as I'll show you in a minute, all thanks to this high pressure that has really been building over the past few days. This is the peak of the heat, though. Notice what's tracking across the island right now. A few showers also moving into central BC. We're seeing them up towards Prince George, and this may come with a strike of lightning or two through the overnight. We are seeing fire danger at high, so something to keep an eye on in the next 24 hours. As this ridge shifts eastward, and it is crossing the Rockies, we're seeing that heat build in through southern Alberta and Saskatchewan today. Everyone under the extreme heat warning east of the Rockies. We're not quite hitting our criteria in BC. And in fact, Environment Canada is saying we're not quite hitting it across the prairies, but because of the added layers of the pandemic and the restrictions, they're going to issue the extreme heat warnings east of the Rockies. Here's a look at the forecast for tomorrow. 30 in through Kelowna. Temperatures are coming down a couple of degrees. We've got a marine push thanks to that system that's bringing showers through the northern sections of Vancouver Island tonight. That is going to bring us a few more clouds to Metro Vancouver. Again, as this high pressure shifts eastward, it's basically opening the door to marine air. But I don't think we'll see the showers quite yet. As I take you through the long-range forecast, I think there's just a slight chance of a morning spitter spot in through Metro Vancouver. Generally, it's a mix of sun and cloud through your Thursday. It'll feel a little cooler, still quite muggy, but notably not as hot as we have been. Mix of sun and cloud for Friday. And then, Anita, we have to say farewell to the summer heat, the early taste, to get right back to those mid-teen temperatures in the rain for the weekend. We'll need it, but I'll miss it. I know you will too.
It was a nice little break.
Thanks, it was.
Jo.
I'm going to remember this. You're welcome.
On Vancouver Island, Indigenous community members are making their own action to find victims of residential schools. It's been 6 years since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report, and none of its recommendations regarding children's graves have been implanted. Now, members of the local First Nations are raising money to rent or buy the ground-penetrating equipment needed to find more graves. It only took 24 hours to surpass their goal after starting a GoFundMe.
This is so impactful through the tears and the gasp when I woke up this morning and I saw the numbers. I was like, wow. And we need to do something in this lifetime to bring them home.
In 2019, the federal government set aside more than $30 million specifically related to missing children and burial grounds. Ottawa says communities can apply for funds starting today. And for the survivors of the residential schools, their trauma is not theirs alone. It's shared by their children and grandchildren. As Christine Birak explains, intergenerational trauma not only has emotional effects, but physical as well.
So many didn't survive the abuse, but those who did likely never imagined their own children and grandchildren would inherit their unspeakable trauma.
I don't have any recollection of my parents as a child growing up at all.
Back then, Adam Northpagan didn't know his parents were residential school survivors. Without role models, they struggled to raise children. When child services put them in foster care, the kids felt abandoned. That anger and that resentment that I bared towards my parents, was very destructive. And it led me down a road of, heavy drinking.
In Canada, there's not a lot of understanding of why.
Amy Bombay studies intergenerational trauma. She says people need to understand how abuse suffered decades ago is affecting Indigenous people today.
We know that stress and trauma is bad at any time during your life, but it's particularly going to have long-lasting effects when it's happening early in life.
To deal with stress, our body releases cortisol, which increases blood sugar. That energy boost can help us react in stressful situations. But childhood abuse can disrupt that stress response for life, leading to consistently high levels of cortisol, which can cause hypertension, diabetes, chronic pain, and heart attacks. Chronic stress also increases the risk of depression and mental illness while lowering resilience and immune function.
This means taking risks.
Psychologist Suzanne Stewart says it can all lead to a complex cycle of trauma, one that can play out over generations in the form of violence, addiction, and poverty.
It takes about 5 to 6 generations for an original trauma to be healed within a family or a group of people, if it is not mediated by current ongoing traumas.
My mom started to share with me stories about what had happened to her.
Northpagan says those stories helped him unwind layers of trauma and systemic racism. He now raises awareness about Canada's history and hopes people will truly listen.
We are good people. We're just not, people out there that, experience social problems and addiction problems. There's reasons why that's going on.
Echoes of pain from lives lost that for decades weren't acknowledged. Christine Birak, CBC News, Toronto.
A coroner's inquest into the death of an Indigenous woman in Quebec wrapped up today. The woman recorded hospital staff making abusive remarks to her shortly before she died. Now, as Sarah Levitt reports, her family is hoping for recommendations that prevent others from suffering as she did.
Pain, sadness, anger, a little bit of hope. All were on display today as thousands took to the streets in Trois-Rivières to honor Joyce Echequan.
They lived with that pain for so long that it makes me emotional, I think it's important that we all know about this.
We're the survivors. We're still here. We've been hurt. They tried to kill us. They tried to make us live the non-Indigenous way, but we're still here.
For weeks, the inquiry heard the circumstances around Echequan's death. Insults hurled at her as she screamed in pain. She had the wherewithal to take out her phone and film what was happening on what would ultimately be her deathbed. That video served as a rallying cry, reverberating not just in her community of Manouan, but across the country. Isabel Nepes drove 12 hours from the Innu community of Equanichit to be here.
We endure that, but we never show it. So now I think it's time to stand up and say enough is enough.
Nous avons le droit de rêver à un monde de bienveillance.
Inside the courthouse, Coroner Jeanne Kamel ended the hearings, speaking directly to Echequan's husband, Carole Dubé, with a message for her 7 children.
Monsieur Dubé, il faudra leur raconter que la petite révolution de la réconciliation a débuté grâce à leur maman.
Outside, that revolution was on full display. Sarah Levitt, CBC News, Trois-Rivières, Quebec.
Now, in the wake of the Tecumloops Tishkwetmik First Nation saying it has discovered children's remains on the grounds of a former residential school, many survivors are sharing their traumatic stories. Marilyn Adolph spent 11 years at the same school in Kamloops. She recited her poem, I Hear You Calling, in honor of so many silenced children on CBC Radio's Daybreak Kamloops this week. And a warning, some viewers may find the details distressing.
I hear you calling. Yes, we sort of knew about you. However, we thought they were just rumors. Still, some of us heard your cries, your heart-touching keening, your silent screams calling us to find you. Cries ever so faint at times I didn't know where to begin searching for you. Cries telling of your longing to go home. As a residential school sister, the longing I am no stranger to, longing to see your mother, father, brother, sister, grandparents or friends, longing to feel security and love in their embrace. Little one, what tragic events transpired for 215 of you to end up here? How is it you were not allowed to make your final journey home, to your community of origin, to your rightful resting place? It makes me ill and angry that you were secreted and hidden away. And I feel physically ill as I consider in my innocence I may have inadvertently been stomping or playing above you due to the dark secrets surrounding you. Now, little one, you can rest more easily as there are nation and international calls for investigations about your demise. No, little one, many communities are making preparations for your final journey home at last. My heart and soul ache for you and your family and friends as it becomes possible to reclaim you and give you the honor you rightly deserve as they embrace you once again as part of their community. Rest assured, little one, soon you will be back in your home community where you belong. Along with the chiefs and lawyer, judge, national child advocate, Mary Ellen Trappel-Lafond, we will continue to call out for nationwide investigations at all residential schools as we probe and seek answers and justice for your demise. I can just imagine the different religious organizations, the curators of the schools involved, saying that perhaps you are from the local community and from before the school was built. Yes, little one, finally, you are the first of likely many we have found you because you never gave up your constant keening. Finally, you will soon be in your rightful community and finally find yourself resting in peace at last. I am a second-generation fellow residential school attendee, a sister surviving 11 years of captivity, and all the while felt your restless presence and heard your mournful cries. Yes, sorry to say, unlike you in the ground, I am fortunately above ground recovering, or at different times, unfortunately, a survivor walking in a ghost-like state, in regression, and now I recognize I am in recovery mode once again from my many years of incarceration. Sadly, the unsurprising although shocking news of finding you all has, I am certain, not only myself, has taken me on an emotional roller coaster journey with each newscast informing on the progress of your find. Come home, little one, come home.
Thank you for sharing that poem with us tonight. You can always find our news program online at cbc.ca/BC. Dan Burrett is here at 11 o'clock after the National. Good night.